Welcome, everybody. My name is Matt Pearsall. I'm the community manager here in the SEL and education community, and I am really glad to be able to join you once again for our SEL and education speaker series. Today, we're going to be coming to you with the latest in our quarterly updates on sources of funding for social emotional learning programs in the United States. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Committee for Children's offices sit on the unceded traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, Washington, the Duwamish tribe. As we honor the Duwamish people and their ancestors, it's also important that we consider our place in the past, present, and future history of the Indigenous peoples of our region, as well as how we can best support them. Thank you. Now, I am very pleased to introduce you our guest. Today, we have Jordan Posamentier. He's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Committee for Children. He's joined us in the past to talk. Jordan is a man of many talents. In the past, he's come to talk to us about equity and social emotional learning. And today he's coming to talk to us about sources of funding because Jordan knows all the things about government in the United States. So thank you very much for joining us, Jordan.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Hi, everybody.
So Jordan, begin with, I think it's going to start talking about federal funding and what's available. And there's a lot of stuff going on these days, and it's really kind of hard to sort through. Before I ask you to kind of dive into what's going on right now with social emotional learning funding, could you kind of back up a little bit and talk about, help us understand how what we've gotten so far to this date?
Sure. Let's go through a brief history of federal social emotional learning policy. Today, let's start with, let's go to like 10 years ago. Congress was barely talking 10 years ago about social emotional and academic learning. In fact, you couldn't really say the term around the Capitol. Either people didn't know it or they'd brush it off because it wasn't their priority. So that started to change about 5 or 6 years ago. Hardly to point to exactly why. It came up in Florida shortly after that time. There was a federal commission tasked to provide recommendations on what to do in response to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas high school mass shooting, if you recall. This was all during the Trump administration. So we actually heard positive support of social emotional learning from the office of Melania Trump, the at time Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, and there were a number of Democratic members of Congress also speaking favorably about it, but mostly in the back room. So maybe it was getting sort of like bipartisan support, starting to grow an interest for policy leaders to spend more time on, and that was kind of how we grew and grew, seeding the idea of SEL federally. So, was there anything specific that they were working on at the federal, for federal policy back then? Oh yeah, let me anchor this a little bit for you. There were a number of like smaller efforts, but the big one that I can recall was Perkins reauthorization. For those who don't know, Perkins was this big piece of federal legislation supporting career and technical education. It was getting reauthorized for the 5th time. And one positive change that was going on during that negotiation process was to include a greater emphasis on what they were calling employability skills. What are employability skills? Well, they're like exhibiting good communication, working well with others, being able to problem solve, staying calm under pressure, stuff like that. And it sounds familiar to our audience, I think, because in effect, it's just SEL by another name. We did a lot of advocacy to help people understand the evidence base, the teachability of it, the value around SEL, all the while using the term employability skills, as that's how Congress preferred to use it for Perkins reauthorization. So they were into the concepts, and the concepts essentially made their way into that successful passed legislation. So the Perkins bill passed with employability skills in it, and that became one source of funding for social emotional learning. What else? Yeah, we started right around that same time. Congress was getting ready to was getting much more comfortable with the term. They already espoused the value of social emotional learning. They would bring it to the policy table. So we pushed to get it started showing up explicitly in funding appropriations and bills where it made sense to talk about SEL explicitly, just, beyond just implicitly, and things like Perkins. So can we fast forward a second now? So we kind of got this little background and laid the groundwork with employability skills and as kind of like an entry into federal funding.
Where do we currently sit? I mean, I think I know you're excited to come and talk about it. So we sit somewhere. Where does SEL sit right now in federal policy?
Yeah, you might have noticed we're in the middle of a pandemic, and how the kids are doing is something that is on a lot of our minds. We've seen acceleration on SEL policy federally. It was already gaining ground, but I think pandemic really moved it forward. Here's why. There was a recent report coming out of the University of Washington Center on Reinventing Public Education and Disclosure. I used to work for them, so I'm biased in their favor. But what they tried to do is gather up across the country what's going on with student mental wellness, mental health. And I'm going to quote from portions of this piece. They found that a significant portion of young people, likely 30 to 40%, have experienced negative impacts on their mental or social emotional health during the pandemic. Does this surprise anybody? Students who learned remotely for long periods of time and historically marginalized students were more likely to experience these negative effects. Again, any surprises? They're kind of telling us what I think most of us already have a strong sense of. Rates of anxiety, attempted suicides, already on the rise pre-pandemic, have increased, especially among girls. Some students fared well initially or even fared better when learning remotely than they did in person, but those positive effects have not lasted, according to the SERPI study. Negative effects for students increased, and then last thing they shared, schools and districts, especially in rural areas, have strong social service infrastructure, lacked systems to track student well-being, or strategies to address and improve it. So the kids are kind of not okay right now, and social emotional learning is front and center as something that we can help kids, return to productive learning.
Yeah, that's a lot. So there's, as we all know, there's a lot going on. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah. So I'll just say it again. SEL is already kind of being accepted as a necessary part of teaching and learning, of the learning equation. And now Congress gets that SEL even more. Kids need it not just for school, but for life. And being able to regulate emotions, form healthy relationships, problem solve, form coping mechanisms in the face of challenge and adversity. I think I won't have a lot of detractors federally at this point saying, "Oh, those are nice, but nah, we can take it or leave it." They're gonna think of these as must-haves, and the question is really, how do we help get the best sorts of these interventions around our kids, especially now?
Well, that's good. I mean, that's progress.
Yeah.
So how is that actually showing up? So is that actually turning into something like concrete in Congress?
Yeah. So Congress has been passing COVID-19 emergency relief funds. This started under Trump. Now it's under Biden. A lot of that funding has gone to schools. It's designed to be very flexible. First round under it's what they call the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, ESSER, fund was for $13.5 billion. Next round, $54.3 billion. So move way up. Most recent one under the American Rescue Plan Act, that was $122 billion. So moved way up. It allows these ESSER recipients, mostly school districts, to spend on SEL if they feel they need to, because it is just that flexible. And I just want to take a step back in here and say, some of you might think Congress is dysfunctional, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I will say they can occasionally advance something that has a benefit to your community. The increase of student mental health challenges were already clear, that this was again, pre-pandemic into 2020. So I think that's why the American Rescue Plan came forward a little differently from the prior two relief acts, because it made explicit spending on SEL. It said,
it's like, hey, it's in there.
Yes, when you get this money, states, you've got to hold back about you've got at least 5% of your relief dollars to address what they're calling learning loss. You can call it learning recovery if you prefer, via evidence-based interventions responding to, and I quote, students' academic, social, and emotional needs. Further, Congress said, hey, school districts, when you get these ESSER funds, you have to hold back at least 20% to attend to the same. So we saw significant and explicit attention around social, emotional, and academic learning, especially in the last round of COVID relief.
So I just want to kind of clarify for a second. So the last round of COVID relief is $122 billion. So much money. $122 billion that was granted to states.
Yep.
And any state that's spending that money themselves, they have to spend 5% of their budget of that on social emotional learning.
on social, emotional, academic learning, attending to learning loss affected by that the pandemic has affected.
And then if they pass that money on to a district or a charter school, that district or charter school has to spend 20% of their money they get.
Yeah, they will have to. So the states are mostly a pass through for these dollars to go down to local education agencies, school districts, charter schools. So yes, a fair portion of that is dedicated to things pertaining to SEL.
That's an amazing amount of money. And all that spending is outside of the regular federal budget.
Yes, and I'm not even going to talk to you about the other COVID-19 emergency relief funds on the governor's side. Never mind the state education. Governors have this whole other bucket, also conducive to supporting SEL, and then some. Now, and there's a whole bunch of competing priorities. Just know there's even more money under the emergency relief. But yes, this was out of the regular budget appropriation cycle that Congress has to go through every year. You want to know what's going on in appropriations, don't you?
Well, yeah, of course, I want to know what's going on in So, but I mean, there's they're working on a budget right now, right?
Yes. Seems like they do this forever and always. Technically, it's supposed to be passed by October. I don't think we should count on that. Those are the olden days. Now we miss our deadline and we go into continuing resolutions, if not budget government shutdowns. But let's not go there yet. It's not October yet. Let's talk about the budget. So we already know Congress recognizes the importance of pre-medical interventions around student mental health. And when I say pre-medical, I mean stuff that non-medical professionals can engage in to help kids so that they don't necessarily have to seek the help of medical professionals. They raise spending levels for any number of provisions already supportive of SEL. So there's the big Every Student Succeeds Act. That's our big federal legislation addressing public school. Title I, which received lots of increases in the current round of budget negotiations. Title I serves impoverished communities. Title II supports educators. Title IV under the Every Student Succeeds Act, it has to do with ed tech, well-rounded education, school safety, and then there was more for Head Start and early child care to boot. There's all these received like significant funding increases so far. I should add that every time that you see something that supports SEL, it also supports like a couple dozen other things. So I don't want to mislead anyone to think that money went up just for SEL, but it's something that still was and is important. It's like part of the conversation. It's how Congress is choosing to help kids and the adults in their lives during this time.
So how do people? So what's the process for access to this? If I'm a school or a district leader, and I would like to tap into these funds, have I already received them? Do I already know the answer to that, or is there a how does this money make it to kids? So
districts will know, schools might not, because districts have a little flexibility in the time frame in which they can spend. The very last round, you don't actually have to spend that money until the end of 2024, but you have to obligate it beforehand. It gets a little techie. I'll skip you on that. But schools might have the opportunity to talk to their central office leads who are managing these dollars and say, you know what, we could use SEL within a multi-tiered system of support, get our counselor who's already doing this work to be able to dig in even further, and here are some ways to spend to get there. So that's an example, but this is one of those times where little a advocacy is warranted. If you're a principal, this might be the right time to say, we've been trying to do this for years. Looks like we've actually got money to do this really well. Let's take advantage of it because that's kind of what it's designed to do. And I know that's hard to ask of people at a time when schools are reopening now, and for some it's unnerving. For others, it's just chaos, and hopefully some are just having a comfortable time. But to actually take a pause and think about strategically the best way to think about these dollars, if you're in a place to move them, is it's an important challenge.
So, I mean, I appreciate you bringing up this idea of like little a advocacy and advocating for this is an opportunity for educators and building leaders to advocate for social emotional learning. How do you suggest they talk about it? And when we started this, you talked about how it was back in before times, we would refer to social emotional learning as an employability skill.
Yeah.
How, I'm straight up, there's a lot of controversy about things in the United States and what's being taught and what's not being taught, and where, and is social emotional learning caught up in that?
You could say that. Yes. I think anything that is getting increased attention is at risk of getting increased polarization. And I think that's just the world we live in, and we're no exception to it. I will say, though, that we do know that people don't necessarily recognize the term social emotional learning nor appreciate it. There was a good survey out of the Fordham Institute, which is a conservative-leaning education think tank. They recently published this study of it's a national representative parent survey on SEL messaging. And so they asked a bunch of parents, what do you think of this term? What do you think about the concepts underlying SEL? Big takeaway is they like the concepts just fine. Across party lines, turns out everybody wants their kid to be able to problem solve, manage their emotions, form healthy like concepts good, term bad. It's pretty bipartisan. They don't like the term. Parents are not inspired by social emotional learning. They like another term. It's life skills is the one, according to this survey, that was most tractable. Now, some of the professionals will bristle and they'll say, you're talking about something else. Stop talking about life skills. You're getting in the way of this field that we're building. And I get that, but a lay audience, a parent audience, isn't a professional audience, and we have to think differently when we're talking to people who think differently. And this is tricky. I know that if we say one thing to one group, we are at risk of annoying another. This, by the way, is an SEL exercise. How do SEL proponents engage with SEL competency in dealing with difference and adapting to change in response to these evidence-based findings? For one thing, just to track back, like when spending these federal dollars, I'd encourage districts to talk in terms that their constituencies understand and appreciate. And it changes all over the country. What's inspiring we'll keep calling it SEL, for folks in Georgia might not be the same as folks in Missouri or Jersey. And if it's to support school safety here, okay. If it's to support student well-being there, if it's to engage priority-wise in academic recovery, who am I to say no to that? It's a tool in our toolkit, and really, it's actually the development of tools for kids.
Yeah. So what does that look like? I mean, I know you're saying it looks different in different places, but can you give kind of like a rough example of what it might look like to talk about it?
Yeah, I'll try to make this even more concrete. When talking to parents about the federal requirement of having to spend on social, emotional, and academic recovery, it's not optional. You got to do it if you're going to do it at all. Talk about the components of social emotional learning in lay terms, like helping kids get along with each other in school after having been on remote learning for so long. Talk about it to them as life skills if you need to. Help them see that it isn't new or one more thing to do. School effort. It's something that we all grew up with in school. All of us grew up with this in school, here and there at least. But now there's a bigger evidence-based support for this sort of thing. Schools can do even better at it, better than they used to, by you and me, especially with this increased funding. I really think just going with the description and not insisting on terms will probably get us farther along.
So it's not about not saying social emotional learning. It's just about being tactful on how we use it and when we use it.
If parents understand the project you're working on as life skills, then I say, you probably want your kids to have, strong life skills, and schools might be a clever place to work with them on getting along well with others. Now, professionals are going to call this SEL, but we totally get that to you, parent, this project is life skills. And let's just agree that same project, different names. Yeah.
Well, so this has been a ton of information, and we're running out of time here. But if listeners want, if folks that are listening want to learn more about federal funding, Are you okay with them reaching out to you?
Yeah, shoot me a note. We can
Okay.
talk the nitty-gritty of dollars. I've tried not to be too detailed, but we do keep close track.
Mhm.
We wrote a blog post on it. I'll be talking again on September 15th
Oh,
at the
that's right.
SEL for the SEL for Texas conference. That's coming up, and
Mhm.
I'll give a little bit more of a deep dive on what are all the dollars and how can you get them. But if you want to see the nutshell of what's going on federally, see some of those deadlines, see some of the buckets wherein you can spend on SEL federal. Uh, yeah, check out the blog post. We wrote it in March.
Okay.
It hasn't changed so much, although I think at this point districts are farther ahead, at least with a good chunk of those dollars, deciding
Mhm.
where they're going to be spent. And also, just a selfish plug: if you want to hang out with us and stay tuned in on advocacy in our neck of the woods, join us, become helpful advocates, so that when comes time, we can help connect your voice to a
Mhm.
policymaker that needs to hear from you, so that we can advance social emotional learning together.
Great. And I will, if you're watching right now, in a few minutes, I'll go in and I'll drop in the links to the blog post and where you can sign up to be an advocate into the chat. If you're looking in Facebook or if you're in Twitter or YouTube, I'll drop it in there. If you're watching as a recording, it's already there. You can see it. So thank you very much for joining us, Jordan. I really this was started as a funding conversation and turned into an advocacy conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time. This has been really informative.
It's been a pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me.
And I want to let y'all know that if those of you who are regular followers of the SEL Education Speaker Series, we have our next event coming up at the end of September. We're going to be featuring Dr. Matthew Farber. He recently published a book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet myself, but I've heard from a lot of people, including Mark Sparble, who's the founder of SEL Education, that it is an amazing book on bringing games, bringing gaming into SEL and teaching SEL through games. And so I really encourage you to keep an eye out for it. We'll have the invite going up in the communities soon. Actually, I think it's already up. But it's there. If it's not there, it'll be there soon. And if you're watching this as a recording, it's definitely there. And love to see you for that. And of course, as always, what is this community that we're speaking of? If you're watching in the community, you already know, but if you're watching elsewhere on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, and you would like to join us in continuing the conversation around social emotional learning funding and advocacy and all sorts of different aspects of the world of social emotional learning, please join us in the SEL Education community on Facebook. It's free to join. It's public. You don't even have to, in fact, to read the group now, you don't even need to have a Facebook account. You can see everything just by going to that URL. We would love to have you join us in the community. It's an amazing group, and it would be just that much more amazing if you were there too. So until then, thank you all very much and take care.